Welcome back, everybody. So the South African Communist Party, or SACP, has decreed the rampant destruction of public infrastructure, saying this portrayed the country as a weak state that cannot ensure the rule of law. This came out at the party's virtual media briefing on Sunday, following the conclusion of its Central Committee meeting held in Johannesburg. South Africa has experienced a surge in the theft of rail network cables, leaving the country's train services in near collapse. Now, in addition, Eskom has also been affected by theft, making it difficult to provide electricity and affecting the already struggling economy. Now, the SACP says the COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated social ills prevalent before the lockdown. To discuss this, we're joined by Mapaila, who is the first Deputy Secretary of the South African Communist Party. Solly, welcome. Good to have you with us.
Thank you very much, Leanne. Good morning to our viewers.
So talk to us a little bit more about the meeting and, of course, what the major concerns, I think I've touched on a few of them, perhaps you want to add to that, of what the SACP is concerned about.
Yes, of course, we still continue to discuss the COVID-19 pandemic and our response as a country. Particularly, we have joined the call by the public sector unions regarding protection equipment for public sector workers, and have similarly decried corruption in the state institutions, particularly regarding COVID-19. And in that regard, have decided to join the mass action called by COSATU on the 7th of October. At the same time, we've also agreed to launch our Red October campaign this year to focus on sustainable livelihoods of our people, in the main resuscitating our campaign, which was last called, established by Comrade Chrisani. We call it the Triple H campaign, which stands for health, hunger, and housing. But the housing now will be characterized as human settlements to broaden that scope since that period. Basically, to fight against hunger in our communities, given that COVID-19 has further created difficulties in the economy for our people to meet their sustainable livelihoods, as well as ensuring that the health of our people is improved. And in that regard, we will intensify our fight for immediate establishment of the national health insurance, which we think at this point in time, given the state of our public health system, becomes much more urgent. So this way, in the field of corruption, for instance, we have agreed to establish what we call a Revolutionary Morality Committee, which will assist the SACP cadres and members to respond effectively to the integrity that is required of the role of an organization like the SACP to uphold revolutionary morality in their conduct across every area where they're deployed.
Yeah, you came out as well, and one of the big things you did say is that you criticized National Treasury and accused it of standing in the way of addressing the systematic features that underpinned the country's corruption pandemic. I must say, I saw a tweet coming from overnight from the Finance Minister, Tito Mboweni, with big question marks around that, saying, what are you talking about? Perhaps you can elaborate. What are you talking about?
We were talking about the general economic interventions. For instance, we had called for the government to assist the poor, particularly during the period of COVID-19 pandemic, for instance, to suspend the payment of their mortgages for houses, for cars and others. But the financial sector was spared, actually. They were allowed to make their own arrangements with people, and those arrangements were quite odious on the people, in a sense that in some instances, some banks will say if they give you a 3 months payment holiday, your loan is extended by 2 years, which is completely unacceptable. It's much worse than if your loan was left with 5 months, and just for a 3 month holiday, it becomes much more extended by almost 2 years, which was completely unacceptable. But they also refused to resuscitate or recapitalize the public investment institutions like DBSA, IDC, and so forth, and instead went on to give the private sector banking over 200 billion through the Reserve Bank as a guarantee for them to borrow to companies that were making up to 300 million rands. But in that space as well, they did not actually succeed, in a sense that only about 20 billion or less has been spent of that particular guarantee, and yet they say they have no money, and they've reneged on the agreement with workers, that is the public sector workers, which we also agree that it's unfair that government reneges on such a multi-year agreement that they've agreed upon with workers. And we think this sent a very bad signal. And also the issue about the access of the country to what we call prescribed assets, which the government prefers to call impact investment assets, which we have no problem with the name per se. That those monies are available in South Africa in big amounts that can be utilized for the resuscitation of the economy. But instead, they sought to go to the IMF and the World Bank, the IMF particularly in this case. And if you look at the conditions of the IMF, majority of them in the letter of the IMF are in inverted commas. They are quoting the South African Treasury. So that means we imposed our own conditions as we went to the IMF instead of literally, there was no basis for us to go to the IMF except to create a license for us in future to go there. We could have used this avenue of prescribed assets of local money, which will be denominated in South African rands.
Yeah, you know, I just gathered from a lot of what you're saying, and also especially when you talk to the borrowing of funds, you talk to the fact that the president had come with good intentions, as you mentioned, saying that there was a well-intended stimulus package that came from the president, but largely represented the rejigging of existing budgets. But you also say that it just defunded many existing programs, and that was thanks to National Treasury. From what I'm understanding, and it just feels like, and also talking to the fact that a lot of the public wage sector agreement was reneged on, it seems that you're very, very unhappy with the finance minister.
Not the finance minister per se, the treasury. I think is the same. It doesn't matter who comes into that particular treasury. I think the big problem is the orientation of the team in that treasury over the years. That they are quick to point out to issues from the West, particularly from the IMF, the World Bank, as well as the OECD countries in terms of interventions for our economy, instead of looking at the real conditions existing in South Africa and responding to those conditions, either in funding models or in assessment. Because, for instance, if you look at Minister Tito's actual document on economic intervention, which came almost 3 months after we won the elections through the ANC, it differed almost drastically from the agreed ANC manifesto in terms of orientation. And we actually were able to demonstrate to him per se, as well as to the leadership, the collective leadership of the movement, the influence of the IMF and the World Bank in those documents. And this worries us that such an institution can have so much influence on the affairs of a country that is facing serious difficulties. And we feel that if the IMF were to change, I mean, the Treasury were to refocus its effort, given the skills that is requisite in the Treasury, but were to refocus its skills on the basis of obtaining conditions in South Africa, we could be able to have a much more effective monetary response as well as fiscal response from the country. For instance, their laissez-faire attitude towards the Reserve Bank, for which the policy mandate of the Reserve Bank comes through the Treasury, that is through the Minister of Finance in terms of our constitution. It's a one reflection of that. But now the Reserve Bank, we have seen recently when there's a crisis, they were able to go deep and actually buy some bonds, allowing us to navigate a difficult period. These are issues that that's why we've said that our country has been in crisis before the COVID-19 crisis, that is economic crisis. And we think that we need a model that can come out of that particular crisis, and that we can't do it if the Treasury's posture remains the way it is.
So from what you're saying, what I'm reading into it is that the SACP feels that the National Treasury is far too conservative in its approach. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, that's exactly the word we use to express how we feel about the National Treasury at the moment. For instance, they're too easy with private capital, but not too easy with public capital. For instance, in December last year, they issued a mandate to sell their stake in the African Bank, for instance, when we've actually called for them to establish public banking sector. Instead of consolidating that space and build a much more functional public banking sector, they don't do that. They continue to lap onto the interest of private capital. That's where the bigger problem is. In fact, that sector, the private finance sector, is the most untransformed in South Africa, both the banking sector as well as the insurance sector and the asset management sector, which completely denies to invest good money in different areas that can give stimulus to the economy of the country. And the Treasury, because this is the private interest, looks the other way around.
Okay, let's move on to another issue, and that is the SACP, the proposal, because one of the big things, and I know that we spoke about it on the program on Friday, we had a big interview with PRASA looking at the theft of railway. We've also interrogated Eskom and spoken to that as well, and the infrastructure that is at Eskom. What is SACP's plan to sort this out, and particularly with reference to the theft and the infrastructure there?
Our main thing is to mobilize our communities to fight against public theft of property, even against destruction of public property. About 2 years ago, we launched a campaign here in Gauteng to defend public property. Not only did we just launch that particular campaign, but we went into different communities to work with the taxi industry to patch up potholes, basically trying to drag government institutions, municipalities, to work with us to protect public infrastructure. But the one in railway has been the most disconcerting to us because of the rampant nature, the destruction. If you see the level of lawlessness of people destroying cables, some of the videos that are available at Park Station, for instance, it's unbelievable that they can do so with no law enforcement taking any action against them, largely because the railway lines were not functioning. But even if that's the case, the extent to which the rail lines actually have been sold in the scrapyards, the stealing of cables that disrupt electricity connection and other things is just unacceptable, and it shows that we're literally drifting into that era of being characterized as a lawless society. And we're now mobilizing our communities to say public property is a property of all of us. No one, no matter how angry they are, should have the right to destroy public property. And I think it started as well when over 20 schools were destroyed in Vuwani, in Limpopo. The communities, based on the issues, some of them became sympathetic to the community's concerns and actually forgot about the most important thing, the destruction of public property. That immediately when you resolve the problems that the people were complaining about, the institutions have been destroyed. And in other communities as well, where people are protesting against something as they destroy another public property, which is unacceptable.
Yeah. Solly, one looks at this and feels that some communities are feeling they're just not heard. And the more they destroy and the bigger the destruction, the more people will listen. And one can assume that it almost boils down to the lack of service delivery. The basic services have not been provided to many vulnerable communities. I mean, this was even before the COVID-19 pandemic. And as you say, the pandemic has only worsened the woes of the poorest of the poor. No water, no electricity, no access to medical care. And this brings on anger in communities, and they are not being heard. And the only way that they can get heard is to do things like this. Do you feel that perhaps this is their way of speaking out and trying to get the government to listen to them?
Yeah, but we think still that is not a right approach, that you don't actually cut your toes to spite your nose as a human being, because immediately you have done that, you have to attend to what you have cut on your own body. So it's the same thing that, in fact, we launched a campaign as a Communist Party. We called it the Public Service Campaign, an Acting Your Neighborhood campaign. This campaign was about mobilizing communities to ensure that there are appropriate public services without destruction of public property. In fact, we're demonstrating to the extent that when we launched our finance sector campaign, we demonstrated in front of many banks across the country. We never destroyed a single window of those banks, even those were even from private sector, let alone those from the public sector. So we should never ever touch and destroy somebody's property, because if somebody destroys your property, you won't feel okay as well. But in this case, we really feel that government have also to be effective in responding to the concerns of the people. That is why we've embraced, even in our discussion, the district model of development as agreed by government, because we think it will bring development closer to the people, and the people can then engage much more effectively with those issues. And we hope that in the coming AGC of the ANC, perhaps a policy position can be taken to do away with provinces, so that there can be a direct engagement with the communities and not have this buffer area of leadership, even of processing of issues that take too long to reach communities. Then the state, the people on the ground can deal directly with the funding model or the intervention space of a government. So they don't have to talk to government in a much more lengthy bureaucratic space. But nonetheless, whatever it is the case, we want to plead with our communities: do not destroy public property. You can make a demonstration, that is okay, but please reserve the public property, because that's your own property. You will need to use that property. We'll still use taxpayers' money, the government money, to rebuild those institutions that we have destroyed.
Solly, I'm going to have to leave it there. I know there's so much more to talk about, your stance on Zimbabwe, also talking to the fact that calling the SACP Secretary General Bladen Zamanda actually using the term turning South Africa into a mafia state, and many, many other issues. But I thank you so much for what you've spoken to us. We will invite you back again. Solly Mapaila, who is the first Deputy Secretary of the South African Communist Party, thank you, talking to us about the party's concerns regarding focusing on the theft and infrastructure damage, rampant corruption in the country, as well as issues at National Treasury. Those are their concerns. Right, we just